Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine discovering that the ultimate cosmic villain, the eternal enemy of God, didn't start out as an evil monster, but actually began as a divine prosecutor working for God's heavenly court. Today we're tracking the epic, centuries-long evolution of Satan. We will explore how ancient empires, cultural collisions, and theological shifts transformed a simple job title into the ruler of demons.
It is a really profound historical journey. When you look closely at these ancient texts, you uncover a narrative that just completely forces us to rethink how humanity has historically made sense of suffering and morality and, well, the divine itself.
Yeah, exactly. And before we jump into this incredible historical timeline, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button. So I want to establish right up front that the mission of our deep dive today is entirely grounded in history. We aren't here to debate personal theology or, tell anyone what to believe. Instead, we're looking at the foundational texts, from the Hebrew Bible to the Dead Sea Scrolls, to understand how humanity's concept of God and its cosmic adversary evolved over time.
And that distinction is incredibly important. Even in our modern era, there is immense internal diversity regarding this figure. You have religious leaders who emphasize a literal living embodiment of evil, while major surveys show that a vast number of modern believers view the concept entirely as a symbol.
Yeah.
But our focus today is setting aside modern assumptions and looking purely at the historical evolution of the concept itself.
Right, because when most of us picture that concept today, a very specific image comes to mind, right? We think of the pop culture pitchfork, the red scaly skin, the bifurcated tail, maybe a pair of horns. It's the stereotypical version you see in classic cartoons or referenced in movies.
Oh, absolutely.
But from what you shared in the source material, that image isn't actually in the biblical text at all.
Not even close. I mean, that specific visual representation is a rather confusing mashup of artistic traditions from the medieval and Renaissance periods. They were borrowing heavily from Greek and Roman mythology.
Like the god Pan.
Right. Exactly, like Pan with his goat legs and horns. To find the true textual origins of the concept, we have to strip away centuries of art and go all the way back to ancient Israelite religion and the earliest texts of the Hebrew Bible.
Which is where I want to start, because reading through those sources completely upended my understanding of this. When you go back to those earliest texts, the idea of a singular, supreme, evil entity who opposes God is just missing.
It is entirely absent. In fact, if we look at the linguistics, the Hebrew word Satan with a lowercase s does appear, but it simply translates to adversary or accuser.
Okay.
It was a common noun used for everyday human beings. For example, in the book of 1 Samuel, the Philistines refer to King David as a potential Satan. They simply mean he might become a military adversary.
So if you were having a property dispute with your neighbor in ancient Israel, you might literally refer to them as a Satan.
Precisely.
It wasn't supernatural in the slightest.
Sure.
But the texts show that the word eventually evolves into a divine role.
Yeah.
How exactly does that transition happen?
We see that conceptual shift most prominently in the book of Job and the book of Zechariah. In Job, we are given a glimpse into God's divine council. Think of it as a heavenly royal court.
Okay.
Present among the heavenly beings is a figure referred to in the Hebrew grammar with a direct object marker, the Satan. It is not a proper name, it is a title.
Like saying the prosecutor or the district attorney.
That is the perfect analogy. He is the prosecuting attorney of heaven. His designated job is to test human faith and report back.
Right.
In Job, he is challenging the authenticity of Job's righteousness. In Zechariah, he is actively accusing the high priest of a spiritual crime, while the angel of Yahweh acts as the defense lawyer.
Okay, let me make sure I'm fully grasping the implications here for our listeners.
Yeah.
At this stage in the ancient texts, this figure is not a fallen angel. He hasn't rebelled against anyone.
No, not at all.
He is actually a functioning, obedient member of God's administration.
He is a celestial employee doing exactly what he is tasked to do. God presides over the court, and this figure handles the prosecution. This framework reflects a very specific theological worldview, an ancient understanding where the supreme deity is responsible for everything, both the good and the adversity.
Right, so there was no need for a cosmic villain because God's court handled the entirety of the human experience.
Exactly.
That makes me wonder, though, if they already had a working system where God's court handled everything, why invent a cosmic bad guy?
Yeah.
What was the catalyst that changed this obedient prosecutor into the ultimate nemesis?
Trauma and geopolitical upheaval.
Yeah.
In 586 BCE, the Babylonians sack Jerusalem. They conquer the kingdom of Judah, destroy the temple, and carry the Judean elites off into exile. This horrific event completely disrupts their society and forces a massive theological crisis. How could their all-powerful God allow his chosen people to suffer such devastation?
It's the classic problem of evil.
Yes, theodicy, the attempt to answer why bad things happen. Eventually, the Babylonians themselves are defeated by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Persians allow the exiled Judeans to return, but Judea remains under Persian control for roughly 2 centuries.
That's a long time.
It is, and during this massive stretch of time, the Judean elites are living alongside Persian culture and, crucially, Persian religion.
And the sources point out that this religion was Zoroastrianism. For anyone who isn't a historian of ancient Iran, what are the core beliefs of Zoroastrianism, and why did it have such a profound impact on the people writing these texts?
Zoroastrianism introduces a highly structured, dualistic cosmology. It centers on a perfectly good divine being named Ahura Mazda, who is locked in a constant cosmic struggle with a wholly evil, destructive spirit named Angra Mainyu.
So I want to use an explain like I'm 5 analogy here. Is it somewhat like the concept of the Force in Star Wars? You have an absolute light side and an absolute dark side, and they're in constant universal conflict.
That is a very helpful way to visualize it. It's an absolute binary. Everything in the universe is categorized into this struggle between pure good and pure evil. Now, when the Judeans, who are already struggling to explain their suffering in exile, encounter the Zoroastrian framework, it offers a compelling theological solution.
Because if you adopt that binary, God doesn't have to be the author of your suffering anymore.
You've hit the nail on the head. We see a slow but undeniable evolution in the Judean theology. The supreme God is increasingly associated strictly with goodness and light. But to maintain that pure goodness in a world filled with suffering, the theology requires a distinct, separate cosmic nemesis to embody all the evil. The heavenly prosecutor role is no longer sufficient. The universe needs an ultimate antagonist.
And you can actually see the fingerprints of this cultural exchange in the surviving literature. I was looking at the notes on the Book of Tobit, which was written during the Second Temple period. It features a particularly wicked demon named Asmodeus as the main antagonist, and historians believe that name is literally a localized version of a Zoroastrian demon, Eshma.
It's a clear linguistic link, but the systemic influence goes much deeper than just borrowing names. As we move closer to the turn of the millennium, we begin to see an explosion of texts that theologize about a grand cosmic war between spiritual forces of light and spiritual forces of darkness.
Which brings us to one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
These are texts hidden away in caves by a Jewish sect over 2,000 years ago. And when scholars finally translated them, they found a front-row seat to this evolving theology.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are vital because they preserve what we call a two-spirits theology. In a major scroll known as the Community Rule, the text describes how the God of Israel created 2 distinct spirits for humanity to walk in, the spirit of light and the spirit of darkness.
And this is where the specific villains begin to emerge, right? Because the texts mention an angel of darkness who is responsible for all wickedness and sin, but they don't call him Satan. They call him Belial.
Yes, Belial is depicted as an evil angel leading a vast army of other malevolent spirits. If you read the War Scroll, another prominent Dead Sea text, it literally outlines a final apocalyptic battle. On one side, you have the Sons of Light, led by the Archangel Michael. On the other side, the Sons of Darkness, led by Belial.
It reads like a fantasy epic. But the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't the only texts doing this. The sources also mention apocalyptic literature like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. For anyone unfamiliar, what exactly makes a text apocalyptic?
In a historical context, apocalyptic literature isn't just about the end of the world. The word itself comes from a Greek root meaning to uncover or to reveal. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, these texts claim to pull back the curtain on the hidden cosmic realities of the universe. They often feature visionary journeys, angelic guides, and elaborate explanations for the origins of evil.
And the Book of Enoch does this by taking a very brief, incredibly mysterious passage from the Book of Genesis and expanding it into a massive cinematic universe. I mean, Genesis chapter 6 has this tiny mention of angelic beings called the sons of God, mating with human women to produce giants called the Nephilim. It is a weird, fleeting detail in the original text.
Very fleeting. But the Book of Enoch expands that fleeting detail into a sweeping narrative. It explains that these angels, known as the Watchers, intentionally rebelled. They fell to earth, corrupted humanity, and taught destructive arts like weapon-making, dark magic, and astrology.
But the wild thing is the leadership of these rogue angels. The chief bad guys aren't called Satan, and they aren't called Belial. The Book of Enoch calls them Shemihaza and Asael.
And they are literally depicted as stars falling from the sky. Meanwhile, another text, the Book of Jubilees, introduces yet another villain named Mastema. How do historians make sense of all these different names? Was it just a free-for-all?
It reflects an era of intense theological experimentation. You have to remember, there was no single, centralized religious authority dictating a unified doctrine at this time.
Right.
Different sectarian groups were grappling with the same philosophical questions and coming up with variations on a theme. You have Shemihaza, Asael, the Belial, Mastema, and the titular Satan from Job all swirling together in the cultural consciousness. It is the gradual blending of all these diverse traditions that eventually forms the prototype of the singular, evil, fallen angel.
So we have all these raw ingredients. We have the cosmic binary from the Persians, the fallen stars from Enoch, and the prosecuting accuser from Job. When does it finally solidify into the figure we recognize today?
That synthesis truly takes hold as we move into the New Testament era. This is when the vocabulary solidifies in Greek. The Greek word diabolos, which originally meant a slanderer or accuser, and is the root for our English words diabolic and devil, becomes the direct translation for the Hebrew concept of the Satan.
And his job description undergoes a massive overhaul in these Greek texts. He is no longer an obedient employee in God's court.
Not at all. While there are still faint echoes of the tester from the Book of Job, such as the narrative where Jesus is tested in the desert, the figure is now overwhelmingly depicted as a malicious, independent tempter.
Right.
He is portrayed as the force whispering betrayal into the ear of Judas Iscariot. Furthermore, early Christian writers attributed to him the power to cause physical illness, madness, and death.
The sources mention that he is established as the archon of the demons. What does that term mean in this context?
Archon is a Greek word essentially meaning ruler, lord, or magistrate. By designating the devil as the archon of demons, the New Testament texts are organizing the spiritual realm into a hierarchy. Evil is no longer just a loose collection of rebellious spirits or a metaphor for bad behavior. It is an organized kingdom of darkness, with a supreme ruler at its head, standing in direct opposition to the kingdom of God.
Which leads to a concept that completely fascinated me in our source material, something pop culture fans know very well, retroactive continuity, or retconning.
Yes.
In comic books, a retcon is when a new writer goes back and changes the meaning of an old storyline to fit a new narrative. The early Christians essentially retconned the Hebrew Bible, didn't they?
Retconning is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Once early Christians established this highly developed theology of a singular cosmic devil, they naturally looked back at their older scriptures through this new lens. They began reassigning earlier antagonists to this newly defined facet of Satan.
The most famous example being the snake in the Garden of Eden. If you just read the original text of Genesis, it doesn't say the snake is a fallen angel or a demon. It just says it's a remarkably crafty wild animal.
Precisely. The association of the Eden serpent with Satan is nowhere in the original Hebrew text. But through the process of later theological interpretation, the snake is retroactively identified as the devil in disguise. The narrative is given a completely new layer of cosmic significance.
But the retconning gets even wilder when we talk about the name Lucifer. I think a lot of people assume Lucifer is the devil's original ancient name, but looking at the book of Isaiah, the origin of that name is basically a translation accident mixed with an earthly political insult.
Let's break down how that happened. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet is delivering a taunt directed at an earthly human tyrant, the king of Babylon. The prophet mocks the king's arrogance by saying, "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn." It was a poetic metaphor, comparing a boastful king to the morning star, which shines brightly but is ultimately erased by the rising sun.
So it's ancient political trash talk.
It is.
But then, centuries later, the text gets translated into Latin.
Yes. When Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin to create the Vulgate, he had to find a Latin equivalent for the Hebrew phrase meaning day star or light bringer. The Latin word for light bringer is Lucifer.
That is unbelievable. An earthly political insult against a Babylonian king gets translated into Latin, and because of the shifting theology of the time, readers assume it's a literal description of an angel falling from heaven. And just like that, the definitive proper name for the devil is born.
It is a perfect demonstration of how translation, metaphor, and later theological assumptions can completely overwrite the original context of a historical document.
When you look at this whole sprawling timeline, from a celestial prosecutor to Persian dualism to Latin translation errors, How do historians even keep all this straight without just throwing their hands up? The sources mention a framework called the 5 C's of historical thinking. How does that help us make sense of this evolution?
The 5 C's are a conceptual toolkit that historians use to analyze complex events without falling into oversimplification. They stand for change over time, context, causality, complexity, and contingency. If we apply them to our discussion, it organizes the chaos beautifully.
Let's walk through them using Satan as the test case. The first is change over time. That one seems pretty self-evident now.
It is evident but frequently ignored by modern readers. The concept of the adversary in the book of Job is separated from the concept of the devil in the Gospel of Matthew by more than half a millennium. A historian cannot assume a word or an idea means the exact same thing 500 years later.
Right, which leads directly into the second C context. This evolution didn't happen in a vacuum.
Exactly. The theology evolved under the specific political and cultural context of the Babylonian exile, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and later the Hellenized world of the Greeks and Romans. To understand why a theology changed, you must understand the lived reality of the people writing it.
Then we have causality and complexity.
Yeah.
From what I gather, this means we can't point to one single event and say, that's the day the devil was invented.
History is rarely that neat. We can't definitively say Zoroastrianism caused the modern devil because it wasn't a singular event. It was a messy, complex, centuries-long cultural exchange involving trauma, assimilation, multiple sects, and shifting languages. The causes are multiple and overlapping.
But the final C is the one that really melted my brain. Contingency. What does contingency mean in historical study?
Contingency is the idea that history is a fragile, interconnected web. Every historical outcome is entirely dependent on a specific set of prior conditions. If you change even one of those prior conditions, the outcome changes entirely.
It's the ultimate historical butterfly effect. Think about the chain of events we just discussed. The Babylonians conquered Judah. That leads to the exile. That leads to the Persians conquering Babylon. That leads to the Judeans encountering Zoroastrian dualism. If you change just one link in that chain, say, the Babylonian army is defeated before they ever reach Jerusalem, the modern concept of Satan as a singularly evil enemy of God might literally never have existed.
It completely shatters a common historical trap known as teleology. Teleology is the false assumption that history is on a predetermined track, marching toward an inevitable destination. People often assume that the modern understanding of religion was always destined to be the final answer. But contingency shows us that our modern beliefs are often the result of historical accidents and variables.
That is staggering. If the geopolitical winds had blown just slightly differently, a completely different theology might be the mainstream worldview today.
Precisely.
Yeah.
To give you a radical example, during the early centuries of the Common Era, there were minority sects who interpreted that snake in the Garden of Eden entirely differently.
Really?
Yes. Instead of viewing the snake as an evil deceiver, they viewed it as a heroic figure, a bringer of necessary knowledge who tried to liberate humanity from an oppressive creator. If those specific groups had somehow gained imperial backing instead of their rivals, that could be the dominant interpretation of the text today.
That completely reframes how we look at these ancient traditions. To recap this incredible journey for everyone listening, we started with a common noun meaning adversary. That became a literal job title in an ancient Israelite heavenly court, a celestial lawyer whose job was to test human faith. Then, through the profound trauma of the Babylonian exile, the collision with Persian cosmic dualism, the apocalyptic visions of the Dead Sea Scrolls featuring fallen stars, and finally the Greek translations and retconning of the New Testament, that celestial lawyer was transformed into the ultimate cosmic enemy of God.
It is a testament to how human beings continually construct and reconstruct meaning. Our deepest philosophical concepts are heavily shaped by the empires we live under, the languages we speak, and the cultures we collide with. And it leaves you with a lingering thought to ponder long after we finish. If humanity's concept of the ultimate cosmic antagonist could evolve so drastically over half a millennium due to ancient cultural collisions and historical accidents, how might our descendants 1,000 years from now conceptualize the ultimate forces of good and evil? What modern cultural forces are subtly rewriting our theology right now without us even realizing it?